Okay, wonderful. Well, Lauren Kennedy West, thank you so much for coming on. We were just having a brief chat before, but I came across your story from a YouTube video and thought, oh, okay, I'll click on this one, thinking, what rabbit hole am I going to get dragged down? And I was just consumed by your story. I think it was so, it's a really hopeful story and it's a important story. So firstly, thanks so much for coming on. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And my first question for you is I'd like to go back to the start of your journey, if I may. How old were you when you first, I guess, came into contact or realized that you had schizoaffective disorder?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in, I think it was 2016. So I was about 25 years old. But I had been struggling a great deal with my mental health and just not really knowing what exactly it was, and also going through a multitude of other diagnoses before I got to the one that seemed to fit the best. I started probably struggling the most with my mental health when I was around early 20s. But early signs started showing up when I was in high school. But I really knew that I kind of needed help navigating it and, yeah, figuring out what was going on in my university years. And that's when I got connected with psychiatrists and GPs and therapists who kind of helped me figure it out. But yeah, went through an initial diagnosis in my teens of depression, and then it changed to bipolar, and then it changed to bipolar with psychotic features, kind of as the psychotic symptoms came more into prominence. And then, yeah, eventually at 25, I was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. And yeah, that seemed to fit the best.
Okay, so before you were actually diagnosed at age 25, what interventions were you experimenting with, or actually, what interventions were psychiatrists recommending before you had your diagnosis at 25 with sort of the depression and all the other things you had going on?
Yeah, so I mean, initial symptoms that looked like depression when I was a teenager, but I'm realizing I were actually the prodromal phase of schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. I was put onto, or I was suggested to put on antidepressants. I don't think I actually took them at that point. And then when I started to really struggle and seek the help of psychiatrists again around 22 or so, I think they prescribed me kind of everything, trying to see what would work: antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, kind of the whole gamut. And antipsychotics seemed to be the most effective, but it still wasn't really helping me feel better. And so we even tried stuff like ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. I went through 12 rounds of that around 24. But yeah, that never really got me to a place that felt terribly great either.
Could you just double click a little bit on ECT for those who aren't familiar? Like, what is it, and what's the process look like?
Yeah, so electroconvulsive therapy, some people know it as shock therapy. That's kind of an antiquated term for it, but basically they kind of place electrodes on your forehead, the side of it, that is intended to induce a seizure. And my understanding is that they don't really exactly know how that works, but it has shown some degree of benefit. Um, I think particularly for people who are struggling with suicidal ideation, but yeah, for various different types of mental health
Hmm.
conditions. It's really effective for some people, but it was not for me, and it kind of left me with, memory impairment as well, and yeah, maybe just a feeling of like increased hopelessness too.
Hmm. It's a theme that comes up on this podcast is, I guess a trend that comes up on this podcast with speaking to wonderful people like yourselves is there's well-intentioned people on the established medical bodies, be it with cancer, be it with mental health, but a hangover of lesser, I guess, a hangover of things that don't necessarily correlate with the best outcomes, and a resistance to try new things, especially when the downside could be so low and the upside so vast. So, yeah, I can imagine when you actually got the diagnosis at age 25. Um, tell me, I guess this leads into my next question, sort of my ramble, but tell me about the process of between being diagnosed and the time period until when you sort of came across metabolic therapies. What was that actual time period?
Yeah, so I really only started metabolic therapies at the beginning of this year. So I guess I was 32. So there's like a 7 year span between there. And I think it was both a relief to get the diagnosis because it finally made sense kind of what was going on, but there was also definitely a degree of grief or kind of um sadness at realizing how this was going to affect my life and realizing how it already had affected my life. But I met my now partner or my now husband um, in 2018, and he has a background in YouTube. And so I had been doing a bit of advocacy locally and just kind of sharing my story with local organizations to various groups around where I live. And he saw this and saw the impact it was having and thought, we could reach a lot more people and have a lot bigger of an impact if you started talking about this and sharing your story on YouTube. And I had no idea about YouTube, but I was like, okay, let's give it a go. And it grew so quickly and it became this incredible experience over those 6 years of really kind of deepening my understanding of my illness and how it affects me and connecting with other people who have shared challenges or experiences. And I think really getting into working on acceptance around what it means to live with a chronic mental illness like schizophrenia, like schizoaffective disorder. And so yeah, I had gotten to a place where I was generally accepting of perhaps some of the limitations or challenges that came with it. And, I was still able to live a pretty good life. I have 3 kids. We worked on the channel together full time and it was good. But there was always kind of this sense of wanting it to be better, hoping it could be better. There could be some better way of managing my illness. There was a lot of different things that I just wasn't really able to do, or a lot of ways that my life inherently played out really differently than what I had once imagined or had hoped for or worked toward as a result of my illness. And so there was always kind of this hope, I guess, that there was a better way of managing it and I could regain some of that capacity that was difficult to have lost. And so actually, maybe you should go back a step. My first hospitalization with my partner for a psychotic episode was in 2019. So about a year after we had met, a year and a half after we had met. And so that was kind of the first time he saw me deeply struggling with psychosis. And so he took out a book from the library. I think it's called, what is it called? I think it's, Gut and Psychology Syndrome by Natasha Campbell McBride. And he read a bit about how the ketogenic diet can be a potential effective treatment for schizophrenia or for other mental illnesses as well. And so we kind of got curious about that and gave it a go in 2020, but we did an awful job of it and did not do it right. And then the pandemic hit and quickly abandoned that, but always kind of remained a little bit curious about the possibilities around it. And then in 2023, we had Dr. Christopher Palmer, who is the author of Brain Energy. He's kind of one of the pioneers in the metabolic psychiatry front and kind of pushing this as a concept. And it was incredible to hear from him, and that piqued our interest even further. And then in December of 2023, we decided, let's make a really good go of this and share it in real time on our YouTube channel. And so that's kind of the evolution of how we came to this project that we've been sharing on the YouTube channel over the last year around metabolic therapies.
And what is your YouTube? I mean, the actual tagline or the what is the YouTube channel called?
Yeah, it's called Living Well After Schizophrenia. So it used to be Living Well with Schizophrenia, but we recently changed it to Living Well After Schizophrenia because I'm not experiencing symptoms at all anymore.
Wonderful. Well, I'm thrilled of the change and the name change. Your husband sounds like he was a gem when we were helping before the podcast, but he's what a gem, what a guy. I think that
Yeah.
hope. Yeah, I'm sure. So that hope from you or your husband, I think it's so important because it keeps you on the hunt for whatever you're trying to solve. I mean, I guess I'm more familiar with the background around metabolic health and certain cancers. And I know when people get a cancer diagnosis, it's themselves and their immediate family are always just suddenly on the hunt for there must be something to help in this world. And I don't know what it's like in the sort of metabolic psychiatry world. Even hearing this story can give people that hope that perhaps there is something out there. So just before we go into more the metabolic world, the misconceptions around people living with, I guess, pretty severe mental illnesses. What would you say are the top misconceptions that you have come across over the years?
Well, it kind of ties into what you were just saying about cancer diagnoses and how, the inherent idea when you're given a cancer diagnosis is, how can I fight this? How can I overcome this? And it's a bit of an externalized thing, where I have cancer, but there is a way to, work toward healing that. Whereas I think oftentimes with mental illness, it more so becomes enmeshed in who you feel you are or who other people feel you are as well. And that becomes a really tricky thing to navigate in terms of maintaining that hope that there is some better way to manage it or even heal it. And so that's been a really interesting experience over this last year of kind of teasing that out within the community and having a better understanding of how mental illness is kind of a different experience in terms of chronic illness, whereby it does really get enmeshed in a person's identity or societally how we view people with mental illness. And yeah, that's been an interesting thing to kind of tease out a little bit more as kind of a more underlying assumption or idea of what it means to live with an illness like schizophrenia or mental illness.
Yes, I think in my research, traditionally things like that were kept under wraps, right? Were not shared publicly with people, and as a result, people assume it's very uncommon, and they don't cross paths with people like that every day. When actually, they're so far from the truth, according to my research. And it's a very lovely. Your YouTube channel is a very lovely example of that. I mean, I got pulled into the thumbnail of your YouTube channel and ended up on your Instagram. I was reading the comments, and it's this whole rabbit hole I never knew existed of people living with this condition, right? But managing it and doing their best and seeing wonderful results as a result of some of the stuff we'll get into. So before we get into that again, just quickly, what does standard of care look like? When you get diagnosis, what does the sort of the cookie cutter approach look like?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of an immediate attempt to get you onto anti-psychotics when you're diagnosed with an illness like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. And that is kind of largely the main push. And my experience anyway with navigating the care system has always been one of trying to dampen symptoms as much as possible. That's kind of the main focus. Yeah, in terms of symptom management being the primary focus in terms of treatment of illnesses like schizophrenia.
Okay, fine. So standard of care is anti-psychotics, which obviously have a very good place. And in 2020, you mentioned that you sort of dip your toe into ketogenic therapy, right? Where did you think you went wrong? You said you didn't quite do it properly, and if I've heard you on other podcasts, where do you think you went wrong with that?
Yeah, we didn't really understand what it meant to implement the medical version of ketogenic therapy. And there wasn't a lot of information out there yet, or that we could find anyway, about how to use it as a proper medical intervention. And so a lot of what we were getting was, kind of more the fad ketogenic diet for like weight loss and stuff, which is different. And it's important to kind of understand that. And so we probably weren't hitting the proper macros. And we were also still doing things like consuming alcohol occasionally, and really have learned that that's not great for metabolic health. And yeah, so stuff like that. We weren't considering any of the other metabolic therapies that are important to consider in conjunction with keto. Things like exercise, sleep, really focusing on sleep, abstaining from drugs and alcohol. social engagement, stress management, and all these kinds of things that really need to be addressed as a whole. We didn't really do.
Okay, so you mentioned metabolic therapies. For someone who hasn't ever heard of metabolic therapy and mental illnesses in the same conversation, could you just give the sort of the overarching tie to why those things are important and should be talked about in the same breath?
Yeah, so there is a theory coming forward. Dr. Christopher Parmel does a great job of detailing it in his book, Brain Energy, but basically that there is a link between metabolism and mental health. And the theory is kind of that mental health illnesses or symptoms of mental illness are really actually a symptom of metabolic dysfunction. And this really isn't a giant leap because I think that it's so clear oftentimes that these really go hand in hand. Signs of metabolic dysfunction that come about at the more physical level are often attached and come with mental health symptoms as well. And so, yeah, the focus really of using metabolic therapies is to try to repair metabolic functioning, repairing mitochondrial functioning and all that in an effort to improve metabolism, which theoretically results in improved experience of symptoms of mental illness.
Brilliantly put. Okay, so fast forward from 2020, where I guess didn't quite pan out with your first try of metabolic therapies, or I guess clinical ketosis, for lack of a better term. What was the term you used? It was wasn't clinical ketosis. It was
I often refer to it as medical keto.
medical keto. Yeah, okay, medical keto.
Yeah.
Let's do it. That's the thing. I mean, the Eskimos have something like 24 different words for snow, but yet we have one. And I think it's the same with keto needs a slight touch up with a brand, because there is, clinical keto for cancer, which is a completely different thing to someone trying to lose a bit of weight, versus medical keto, which I'm sure look very different. And there's different ways you can slice this. So in 2023, in December 2023, you went all in on medical ketogenic therapies. First of all, let's define what that actually looked like on a day-to-day, and sort of how that plan came about, what the plan was, and your first couple of weeks in that plan.
Yeah, so I ideally had wanted to try to find a metabolic psychiatrist who could kind of guide me and oversee this and stuff, but they're really hard to find. And I'm in Canada, and a lot of the ones that I found were in the United States, and so they couldn't see me. So what I ended up doing was just sharing with my care team what I wanted to do, sharing with my psychiatrist, my GP, my therapist, and kind of making sure they were all on board. But then what was really crucial was I got connected with a keto coach. She's a therapist who specializes in nutrition, specifically using ketogenic therapy for mental illnesses. And so she was really crucial in terms of having a resource to know how to do it properly. But basically what happened was what we did was she set me up with macros that I was supposed to hit. So what I mean by macros are the breakdown in what I eat in terms of fat intake, protein intake, and carbohydrates. And the idea with medical keto is to keep carbohydrates very, very low. We had a maximum of 20 grams of net carbs per day. And then the idea is to have a really high fat intake and moderate protein. And we used an app called Chronometer to make sure, to weigh and track all of our food to make sure we are hitting those macros at every meal and at every day. We also got really focused on making a routine out of exercise, trying to get more focused on doing a better job with sleep, taking steps to improve that. No more drugs and alcohol. What else? Yeah, just working on all those different kinds of metabolic therapies and trying to be really regimented about how we approached it. And also sharing it in real time on our YouTube channel.
Wonderful. And the first couple of weeks, how did your body react to such a new intervention in your whole body system?
So the first time we did it, we experienced a huge amount of what's referred to as the keto flu. And I think it's when your body is kind of having a hard time adapting to this new way of eating, which really is supposed to change your energy source. It changes it away from your body using glucose as fuel and more toward burning fat, which produces ketones, which your body then uses as fuel, your body and your brain. And so that can be kind of a difficult experience to transition for a lot of people. But I did not experience any bit of the keto flu, and it was pretty smooth. However, my husband is doing it with me, and he definitely did experience the keto flu. So that is something that can happen. I'm very lucky that it did not happen to me this time. But it was about a week in to using or to changing our diet to this different way of eating that I started to kind of pick up on this feeling of increased capacity. And that was something that I struggled a lot with throughout the course of navigating my illness, is always being a little bit disappointed by my capacity or struggling with feeling reduced capacity. And so this was probably the first thing that I noticed. And I remarked to my husband, I think, around feeling like I had more capacity and energy and could give more of myself to our kids specifically. That's kind of the main way I noticed it to begin with. We kind of thought like, well, there's no way it can be working this quickly, like that feels like maybe you're hoping that's the case because a weekend, how could that be? But it just kept being more and more of that feeling of increasing capacity, and also realizing that I wasn't noticing symptoms that usually I experienced on a daily basis. And so it was, I think we went into this with a degree of skepticism, but quite quickly was pretty blown away with how drastically it changed my experience of my mental illness, and
Wow.
then my experience of how I was able to experience my life.
So so that was the first week. That's incredible. With I guess two sort of follow-ups. How did that continue to build? And were you, obviously, I assume you were working with with a psychiatrist, and you had antipsychotic medication alongside this to start, if I understand the story correctly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I started this project or using metabolic therapies on a pretty standard dose for me of antipsychotics. I was on lorazepam. I was on 100 milligrams. And that was kind of what I needed while I was stable. I had been on higher doses at various other points in my illness, but that's where I was when I started. And it was interesting. About 3 weeks in, I guess to start off, I started this project with the idea that I would not change my medications at all until at least like 6 months into using metabolic therapy, so that I really had a good idea of its effect and if it was going to be even possible to reduce my medication at all. But 3 weeks into using the ketogenic diet, I started to experience like really, really intense levels of sedation. And I was worried at first that, oh no, is this a side effect of keto, or is this, I didn't know what was happening. But I went to my keto coach, and she actually brought forward a new concept called potentiation. And so I learned that potentiation is when you are basically implementing two different therapies. They can kind of intensify the effect together over what the effects would be individually. And so all of a sudden, once I had introduced ketogenic therapy and it was really having a positive impact on my experience of my illness, I then experienced over medication. And so I was experiencing way more side effects of the antipsychotic that I was on at the level that I had started off at and been fine. Now, all of a sudden, the side effects were more pronounced. And so I had to go to my psychiatrist, and we had to figure out what it could look like or how to safely start to reduce the antipsychotics so that I wasn't experiencing this overwhelming amount of side effects from it. And so we went down to 80, felt a bit better, but still was experiencing the the sedation. And so then we went down to 60, and I felt so much better at that point too.
Wow. Okay. And what's the relationship with the antipsychotics currently today?
Yeah. So I think when I went down to 60, I started to realize that I was feeling a bit more like myself and a bit better, having reduced the amount of antipsychotics that I was on too. And I just kept feeling more capacity and feeling better the longer I did keto for. And I think about 3 months in I decided to just try to reduce my medication again with my psychiatrist. Of course, all of this was done really in close contact and close collaboration with my whole care team. But we decided to reduce my medication again to 40. And it was good. I still wasn't experiencing symptoms, but I did start to experience withdrawal effects of reducing my antipsychotics. And so that was kind of unanticipated, but learning going through this that it is a really big problem and common problem for people who are trying to reduce or go off of psychiatric medication like antipsychotics, but kind of pushed through that and continued to reduce very, very gradually and under the supervision of my care team. And actually, in September of this year, I took my very last dose of antipsychotic, and I have been completely off psychiatric medications now for 2 months, just over 2 months.
Wow. Well, congrats, and I wish you every success and hope it continues to go in the right direction. And just to be crystal clear, so you've been, I guess, for lack of a better term, you've been symptom-free.
Yeah, I don't know the last time I experienced a hallucination or delusion or paranoia. And yeah, it's just not affecting my life in the way it did for over a decade.
Wow. So, in my research for this podcast, Chris Palmer talks about some of his studies being a switch, where when the groups were diligent and strict with their metabolic therapy or with medical ketosis, there was a lot of good outcomes and symptoms were favorable. However, when they resulted back to a more traditional lifestyle of burning glucose for energy and not being in a state of ketosis, a lot of things returned. Day to day, you must have to be very diligent with your diet. And how do you go about that day to day? How do you go about when you travel and implement this lifestyle?
Yeah. So I kind of thought that this would be a lot harder than it is. And I think that a lot of people also have this assumption that it's really, really difficult to maintain such what is often deemed restrictive diet. But when you kind of reframe your mentality around it to one of, okay, I'm going to choose foods that are going to fuel my body and my brain in a way that is going to allow it to function its best and in a way that allows me to be free of the kind of really debilitating symptoms that I experienced for over a decade, it becomes actually pretty easy to commit to that. And so I think it was also really helpful that I'm doing this with my husband because, we could cook meals together and we can support each other in that way. But yeah, once I learned what foods were going to be best to hit the macros I needed and to feel my best, it really became pretty easy to keep it up day to day. I was really stressed out the first time I traveled, thinking, "Oh my gosh, how am I going to do this?" Like it's really hard hitting the right medical keto macros, eating out at restaurants or yeah, when you don't have control over what you're making and, in your own kitchen. But I've definitely learned tips and tricks for how to do it. I brought food with me, a lot of food with me, which was helpful. And yeah, there's tips like you veer more toward the meats and maybe some vegetables at restaurants, and you ask for a side of butter or olive oil. And yeah, there are ways to increase the fat and keep the carbs down, even when you don't have immediate control over what you're making.
Yeah, I would say most of the time I try to be in a state of ketosis most of the time, not all. But my ketosis might look very different to the levels you require versus someone who's doing a ketogenic diet for cancer. So for me, just for this is my preference, ketogenic therapy as opposed to some medical ketogenic therapy, is I liked my blood millimolars, which is testing for a ketone called beta hydroxybutyrate, as measured by blood. I like my millimolars to be over 1, and I feel pretty good. What millimolars do you try to stay above?
Yeah, so that's a really important component of medical keto is making sure, or really keto for any medical ailment, probably cancer as well, is really making sure you're staying on top of maintaining a certain range of ketones. I think Dr. Chris Palmer recommends over 1.5 most of the time. But for me, I really found, especially in the beginning, that I benefited the most when my ketones were over 3. Um, that was really a good range for me. It kind of lowered a little bit as I think my body got more efficient at using the ketones I was producing, but it still feels the best for me to be at least over 2 and in that like 2 to 4, even 5 range. But something that's interesting as well is that it's also really helpful to measure your glucose too, because those together give you a score called a GKI score. I think it's the glucose ketone index score. And you ideally want that to be under 2. And I think for cancer treatment, I think they ideally want it to be like under 1. And so that's a really important metric too when you're doing it as a medical intervention.
Mm. And I think for people who haven't gone down that whole rabbit hole, I think the important thing to realize is, well, I guess the question that comes off the top of that is, oh, but you're not eating any sugar or glucose. How could you have any glucose in your body? And then this thing called gluconeogenesis comes into the equation. It makes the whole thing more complicated when you're learning about this. But your body always does produce a state of glucose. I mean, even the initial George Cahill studies, you fast people for 40 days, and yet they still had a pulse of glucose from gluconeogenesis, which can spike from
Mhm.
proteins and things. So you have to be mindful of this. And actually, when you start testing your blood for ketones and glucose, you do realize what spikes your glucose naturally, and it's an interesting thing to get to know your body on a better level, but it does take the right kit. What kit do you use to do it? Do you use a G kit, blood prick? Do you have a continuous keto monitor? What do you do?
Yeah, so excuse me, I have which arm is it on this one? A continuous ketone monitor, and we've also used a continuous glucose monitor to see both those. But we've also used, it's called the Keto Mojo blood test, and so you can test with a strip for ketone levels, and you can test with a strip for glucose levels, and that one is actually really cool because if you test both those, it gives you a combined GKI score, which is what I was talking about, which is important to consider too. But in terms of testing ketones, we kind of tested everything just for the sake of sharing possibilities for people through our YouTube channel. So we tested urine strips, which are the least accurate or the least specific, I guess, but good if you're on a really tight budget, just to know whether you're in ketosis or kind of how deep into ketosis you are. We also tested a breathalyzer, which also was not as accurate, or maybe not as accurate, as specific of a reading as the blood monitor or the CKM and CGM.
Mm. I mean, I'm sure it'll be developed soon, but someone needs to develop a wearable on the back of one's arm that can do a GKI, measure glucose and measure ketones at the same time, and be able to calculate your glucose ketone index. That'd be the dream. I haven't come
Yeah,
across that. Is it
I think that is in the works with a company, but it's not quite available yet.
okay? Great, great. Yeah, it'd be super valuable. So for those again, above 1, above 3, all these different numbers. Above 3 is hard. That is, you're not. I think if you start getting into ketosis, I think you'd be lucky. You're not going to see those kind of numbers in the first week or two. In my experience of people who I've um, experimented with keto with. So how do you actually go about getting above 3 on like a granular level? Is there a role for exogenous ketones in there as well?
Yeah. So I think that it might look a little bit different from person to person. It's been really interesting going through this at the same time as my husband because we could very easily compare our ketone levels based on very similar food intake and similar exercise and all that sort of thing. And so my ketone levels have always been higher than his, even with the same meals and stuff. So I think it is important to understand that it is going to look a little bit different from person to person. And I've also heard from people that different levels of ketones feel best for them in terms of their mental health and whatnot. So that's an important thing to consider. I was just kind of one of those people who felt better with high ketones, and I could achieve that pretty easily too. What really helps in spiking ketones is obviously high fat meals, but also exercise. It was really interesting, especially with the continuous ketone monitors, to see what happens in exercise. And you start, and then there's a dip down in ketones because I think your body is using it. But then after the exercise, maybe about a half hour later, it just spikes up and your body just starts pumping more ketones. And yeah, it really increases ketone levels. In terms of exogenous ketones, my keto coach, her name is Nicole Laurent, she had suggested to kind of maybe not go that route, and to encourage your body to produce its own ketones and whatnot. But I kind of wanted to give it a try more for the sake of a scientific experiment to communicate in this project on our channel. And something that I did not anticipate happened. So we used the salts, one of the salt options for exogenous ketones, and I took it before a soccer game in the hopes that it would, improve my energy or allow me to, perform better at soccer. And I was not feeling well during the soccer game. And then after the soccer game, on our way home, we were driving and I was looking out the window and I remember thinking, uh-oh, this feels like psychosis or like symptoms of my schizophrenia. Like, what is going on? And so we took a look at our ketones and glucose when we got home, and my ketones had plummeted into like almost not even in ketosis, and my glucose had shot up. And so we were super confused, took a closer look at the list of ingredients, and I think we were actually surprised when we first ingested it because it tasted really, really sweet, even though there was no sugar and no carbs in it. But we took a closer look at the ingredients, and one of the ingredients was sucralose. And so that is kind of how I came to understand that I am really, really sensitive to sucralose as an artificial sweetener. And so I learned that that kicks me out of ketosis. And so that experience happened pretty early on. And that was also kind of cool in its own way of confirming, okay, being in ketosis is profoundly protective or therapeutic for me. And when I get kicked out of ketosis, I get symptoms back almost immediately. So a bit of a learning experience. And but since then we have found other forms of exogenous ketones that don't have sucralose and have been much more effective. And I really only rely on those when I relied on them when I was going down on my medication and experiencing withdrawal symptoms, and my brain could just benefit from an extra boost of ketones. Anytime I'm struggling a bit more is when I'll use it. But generally speaking, don't use those too much.
I think it's really impressive. I mean, I've tried to get above 3 for a while, and I can do it with exogenous ketones. Can't do it. I haven't yet to do it without. So I'll keep you posted because that's my next challenge. And because I'm curious, I've never actually experimented with a continuous ketone monitor. Tell us about the fluctuation of your ketones throughout the day.
Yeah, so it took a while to notice trends because I think it was kind of all over the place to begin with as my body was trying to figure out, okay, what are we doing with this? What is going on? But, later on, I'm starting to realize that, exercise really peaks my ketones, and it actually just on average raises my ketones for like a day or two after exercise. And so if I'm regularly exercising, it just kind of stays high, which is really important. What else? So it generally gets higher in the evening, and then my lowest levels are usually like right when I wake up. And I don't remember the exact scientific reason for this, but I think that is a pretty common trend. And it's why it's recommended that if you don't have continuous monitoring of your ketones, or you can only test once or twice a day, that you definitely test in the morning so that you know kind of what your lowest level is and before you eat and whatnot.
Yes, I think it's to do with the natural, your natural spike in cortisol in the morning. Glucose will follow that natural rise, which is healthy. You want that natural circadian rise. But it can freak people out when they test only in the morning and think this is not working. Probably will, just give it a couple of hours. Okay, super interesting. Well, I've got a challenge to get above 3. This is good. Let's talk about other things you implement for your metabolic health. So you mentioned exercise. What kind of exercise?
Yeah, so I've always been really big into running, and I know that that has always been really beneficial for my mental health. Understanding it more as affecting my metabolism is cool, but really became more regimented and making sure I was doing that kind of all the time. Got into weightlifting. I played soccer. We did that before as well too. Got into swimming, biking. I did my first triathlon. Um, and yeah, just really trying to make sure that it's a really big part of our daily routine and understanding that it's a really crucial part to maintaining mental wellness.
Mm, 100%. I think the there's so many lessons of this already, but even if you look at mental health and different mental illnesses in a silo, in individual buckets, I think it's limited. If you look at mental illnesses as a spectrum, and all sorts of different things can happen. There's a lot of lessons, right? I think everyone can relate to having a better, more positive mental affect when they've been exercising regularly, and metabolic therapies can be, you don't have to have been diagnosed with something like yourself to maybe be curious to give these things a go. Obviously, with your doctor and a health practitioner, um, with their guidance. Um, but yeah, I think extremes teach the best, good or bad, and what's working for something quite extreme and severe can teach you lessons about maybe something that's less severe but still can affect your everyday life. So yeah, I think it's a good message, and exercise is wonderful. You must hear loads from people all around the world reaching out to you with similar stories. Could you share some of those stories?
Yeah. So I've been so grateful to meet other people who have very similar experiences of healing their mental illness that was debilitating for a large part of their life through implementing metabolic therapies. And one of the really, really cool things about sharing this in real time on our YouTube channel is that there are a lot of people who decided to kind of give this a go at the same time as me and to kind of go through this alongside me, or people who have been inspired to try it at various other points in this project. And it's just, it's been incredibly, it's just been amazing to hear how it has improved these people's lives as well. And there are so many people every day commenting that their experience of their illness and subsequently their experience of their life has been profoundly changed for the better through implementing metabolic therapies. And so, yeah, it really just reaffirms this need to keep spreading awareness about this and information for people who are interested in trying it in an effort to, yeah, improve their quality of life.
I think it's such an important point for a few reasons. Um, I think the traditional academic world, you need a randomized controlled study and a few of them ideally before anything's even looked at, and I think that's limited. I think you need replication. If something has been replicated more than once, that should people should take note of that. And I'm not saying it's the all and end all. I looked today, there are 7 clinical trials going on specifically for schizoaffective disorder, not bipolar and other things, schizoaffective disorder and metabolic therapies, which is wonderful. So they'll come. But in the process, the N of 1 experiences that actually get replicated out, so your story and many other people around the world, is they're equally powerful to take note of, and important to get out there as well. Because I think those are the things that build momentum for the literature to take off. What other disorders? Well, I guess disorder might be the wrong word, but what other mental illnesses do you see people having positive outcomes with metabolic therapies?
Yeah, I mean, I've met individuals and I've heard from many individuals who have had great success treating their bipolar disorder, treating their depression. I've met people who have had success treating their OCD, anxiety, kind of just the whole scope. And I think it's interesting just understanding mental illness less as being these specific categories that we've come to kind of put people into, and understand it more as it's just kind of a spectrum of symptoms that people can experience as a result of this underlying metabolic dysfunction. And so obviously there's going to be some impact or benefit for anyone experiencing any kind of these symptoms to heal their metabolism. And something that was interesting is I've shared on our channel that I've struggled over the years with an eating disorder. I've experienced anorexia and bulimia. And while I got to a place where I wasn't actively struggling with this at the beginning of this project, I think maybe anyone who's struggled with an eating disorder kind of maybe understands that it's kind of always there, just at various volumes in terms of how much brain energy it takes up. And it's always kind of going to be something that, for me anyway, is always something that I struggled with a little bit, even if I wasn't, really actively sick with it. And that was something that has been really interesting to take note of, is that my relationship with what I used to struggle with around my eating disorders is not existent anymore. There's no part of my brain that is really focused on that anymore, which is something that it was kind of almost every day for a long time for me. And that was something that I was really not anticipating, because when we initially started this, I was kind of worried, and tons of other people who knew I had a history of an eating disorder were worried about how engaging in a restrictive diet could exacerbate symptoms of an eating disorder. That kind of seems counterintuitive, that that would help with this. It really seems like that would exacerbate it, kind of playing into some of the problematic behaviors that often come along with an eating disorder around food restriction and stuff. But we had Dr. Guido Frank on our channel for an interview about his study on using ketogenic therapy in the treatment of anorexia. And it is incredible what is happening in his work and other work being done around this that is finding it to be incredibly impactful. And this is really interesting, because I think that's something that there just hasn't really been very good treatment for ever. Like there's always the idea of, weight restoration, but it never really heals the underlying issues that people with eating disorders really struggle with. And so, yeah, I won't talk too much about this, but it's really, really interesting how it can even impact something like that maybe you wouldn't expect.
Oh, it's fascinating. I'd love. What was the chap's name again? Who did that experiment?
Dr. Guido Frank.
Okay, well, I have to reach out to him because he sounds amazing. I haven't heard of that study. But I want to read the study. My understanding is anorexia. No, I always struggle with the second bit. Anorexia is the most deadly psychiatric illness, which I don't think many people. It's not common knowledge that. And I think the next question is, well, why? Why does changing one's diet affect all these different mental illnesses? And to get your head there, as you elegantly put, it doesn't make sense unless you look at these on a spectrum. And then it starts to slightly make more sense towards better metabolic health, less symptoms of metabolic dysfunction, and downstream of metabolic dysfunction are these various different siloed conditions. It's almost like a flaw of the human mind is to silo everything. And actually what we're going to try to do in this podcast is to sort of see the woods and not the trees. Do you know, I know that when one is in a state of ketosis, more than one, let's say, but when you're above 0.5 millimolars, I know that it is a GABA antagonist, meaning it upregulates GABA, which is the neurotransmitter of the break, if you like. If dopamine would be more, if serotonin would be comfortable, I have everything. If acetylcholine would be the gas on the car, GABA is the brakes. And for me personally, I like ketosis because it helps me think better and it slows me down. And I feel like I can get the most out of my mind, which I need all the help I can get when I'm in ketosis. What other benefits have you experienced whilst being on this method? I mean, there's quite a few already you've mentioned, but have you noticed anything sort of periphery as well as the ones you mentioned?
Yeah, so I mean, no more symptoms of my schizoaffective disorder is a big one. what you just mentioned around like mental clarity and improved cognitive functioning is also a really big one. With schizophrenia, it is a thought disorder, and cognitive impairment is one of the main classes of symptoms, as well as negative symptoms, which are kind of stuff like lack of reduced motivation, reduced energy, changes in mood like that. And those things have been impacted in a good way through keto as well, which is something that medication was just never able to really address, is the negative symptoms and the cognitive symptoms. It mainly focused on positive symptoms like hallucinations, delusions, and those kinds of symptoms. But I think it's just kind of improved my health as a whole. I feel better in my body. There's less inflammation, which has been really great. But something else that was kind of an unintended effect of this is that I have PCOS, which is polycystic ovary syndrome. And I didn't get a period really ever. It was always very irregular. And that was something that, just never really was regular for me. But since starting keto, it has like pretty much completely regulated. And I have a completely normal menstrual cycle now, which is kind of wild. And is very unheard of for people who are living with PCOS. And so, it's clear that metabolic health is so integral to so many different facets of our overall health, not just brain health, not just, it's all connected. And I think that it's been interesting to bring more awareness to that and to understand that a bit better.
Yeah, it's I, as sort of a self-proclaimed health nerd, I can get lost in the maze of complexity. I've got to do this, got to look at the sun at this time, got to ground my feet because of this some reason I've read a paper on. And actually, you swim upstream and you get to metabolic health. And if you just optimize for metabolic health and or fertility, I would maybe add in the same bucket, but it's sort of one and the same thing, right? You just seem to get all the other things you're optimizing for. You get better brain function, you get better energy, you get better mood, you get better thought, you get better everything. It does seem to be the main thing in health. I'm very bullish on metabolic health over the next decade. And I guess I would really want to understand the mechanism of why it helps all these different things. But maybe one proposed is GABA, and it sort of can quieten the mind. I know for people with OCD and anxiety, sort of rumination thoughts can be quite potent, and being in state of ketosis seems to quieten the volume. Interesting. I'd love to explore the mechanism more as the research comes out over the years. I guess what message do you have for people who they're listening to this and they're thinking, okay, well, maybe they have a diagnosis, maybe they don't, but like everyone, can struggle with mental health throughout their life. What message would you have for those people who are maybe on the fence and maybe thinking about giving this a try?
I mean, I think for a long time, I just kind of resigned myself to accepting that I wouldn't be able to operate at a capacity level or engage in my life really in a way that I had once hoped or wished I could. And I just want to provide a degree of hope that you don't need to accept that. There are ways to improve your experience of your illness and thus your quality of life. And maybe that will look a bit different than how I've done it, but it is possible. And I think for people who are on the fence about trying metabolic therapies, kind of the mentality I took when I started this was, what is there to lose? It's a pretty low risk intervention, really. It's really just changing what you're eating. There's not a lot of side effects that really come about that, or danger inherent in that. And so even if you just try this in conjunction with your medication or whatever treatment is helping keep you stable at the moment, even if you just try this adjunctively for 3-4 months, just to see if it can help your experience of your illness at all or improve your quality of life at all. And if it does, amazing, keep exploring that. And if it doesn't, it's not that big of a deal to just go back to what you felt was working for you before. And so, it just feels like a really what's the harm in trying kind of thing.
The mentor of
Because,
mine.
and the other components of this are like metabolic therapies, like improving exercise, improving sleep, improving not doing drugs and alcohol. These are obviously things that we all understand are going to help you no matter what. And so there's no real downside to giving that a go and making it a part of your routine and seeing how it can improve your experience of your illness.
Well put. There's a mentor of mine says, heads I win big, tails I don't lose much. I just thought it's such a lovely frame.
Yeah.
I put this in that bracket for sure, especially if one is suffering with some sort of anxiety or, I don't know, different, if you have a diagnosis and you're working with a professional, please, speak to a professional, but also don't be afraid to bring these things up with your professional provider. I'm sure you have met people who come back with a lot of resistance and lack of belief. I mean, what's your experience been with, I guess, that overcoming that dogma?
Yeah, this is maybe the biggest hurdle we're facing or we have faced over the last year is really big resistance and pushback to this kind of new way of thinking about mental illness and mental health and health as a whole. And really, it's been interesting kind of wading through a bit of what I touched on at the beginning of how mental illnesses really become inwoven in how we see ourselves as people or how we see others as people. And it really gets enmeshed in our sense of identity. And so when you kind of understand that, it does make a lot of sense that providing or asking people to have this kind of paradigm shift in how we understand mental illness is feeling really challenging and almost threatening in some ways to this sense of identity that many people have built over the experience of navigating their mental illness. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of work to kind of tease this out as a collective community in terms of reframing how we understand our experience of mental illness and of symptoms and kind of trying to remove it from our sense of self and understanding it more as symptoms of metabolic dysfunction. And so there's like a lot of layers to unpacking all of this, and it's really complicated, but I understand why there is the pushback that there is. It's really asking people to go against the status quo in psychiatry and what has been established as best practices. And it's asking people to start being more reflective of their satisfaction with their quality of life, which can be a bit of a difficult exercise in its own if there is a degree of dissatisfaction. And then kind of understanding that you kind of need to take steps to work on that. And it's difficult because, I don't think that it's complicated, like it's not just as simple as, I think we've always been fed this stuff that has felt patronizing in terms of, well, just eat better or just get a good night's sleep in order to improve your mental illness. And I understand how this can kind of get pooled into that and feel almost patronizing or like it's invalidating the experience. But yeah, I think we collectively need to kind of wade into understanding this as a bigger picture and looking at metabolic health and its impact on symptoms that people experience.
Definitely. I really admire people like Chris Palmer and Thomas Seyfried, who's, I guess, doing the equivalent for cancer, where there's a consensus opinion, and actually Chris Palmer's opinion is not that of the consensus. I think he referenced Gabor Mate thinks all mental illness is a result of trauma, and yet Chris Palmer talks about it being a problem of the metabolism. Thomas Seyfried, the same thing. Cancer is a genetic disease. Cancer is a disease of the mitochondria and your metabolism. And I admire the contrarians willing to have the independence of mind in and amongst the crowd. I think it's a really hard thing to do, and I think a lot of secrets lie in that sort of realm. I had another point. No, I've lost it. Whatever. Something you said, a lot of interesting things, so it's hard to hang off. If we end with a couple of quick fire questions, which we always do on the podcast. You okay with that?
Sure.
Great. Sorry, I just had a tangent. I was like, ah, okay, whatever. So, uh, first quick fire is: do you have any guiding thoughts or ideas? Could be a favorite book, could be a favorite quote that you try and live your life by.
Oh, I don't know if I have any quotes or anything like that, but I think throughout this experience, particularly, I got a little bit lost in the emotional experience of thinking about and getting a little bit sad about how my life could have been different if I had experienced this sooner. And if I had been able to address the metabolic dysfunction earlier and not have to go through over a decade of kind of suffering through navigating this. But I think kind of the overarching perspective that I've tried to bring with me throughout years of navigating this illness and life in general is that there's tremendous opportunity for growth within suffering, and it is a really integral part of the human experience, and trying to understand suffering as that opportunity for growth and also an opportunity for connection with other people. I've said many times on our channel, and maybe this is the overarching quote, is that there's so much power in vulnerability and being honest with others about the experience in an effort to create connection, and being honest with ourselves about the experience in an effort to, work toward that growth.
Well, I think there's a lot. There's so much there, and a lot of power to being vulnerable in your own different way. Good catch. And especially when someone like yourself is vulnerable, you have the ability with your YouTube channel and your own story. You can affect the course of so many people's lives, which is wonderful and really admirable that you actually are so vulnerable. And I definitely appreciate you being so vulnerable here with us today. I could talk all day and have so many other questions, but I appreciate you have better things to do than talk to me. The point I wanted to come back to was why. And I think two things of going through struggle, connecting to a why is super important. I guess sort of ruined anyone who's interested in reading the book Man's Search for Meaning. Still read it. It's a wonderful book, but connecting to that why can help. But also as the way to make this more mainstream, which was the point I forgot a minute or so ago, is when you can give people the why behind the mechanism, they can understand it more than just it's a diet that you're trying to lose weight for. Here's one proposed pathway why it works, but it's so complicated where it might take a while. Like, they still don't really know about the mechanism behind keto and epilepsy, but yet it's way more effective than any drug ever made. They don't quite know how it works. It's got some proposed theories, but it's interesting nonetheless. Lauren, thank you so much for coming on. It was a real privilege for me. Really enjoyed the conversation. I think your story is wonderful. Where can we keep up with what you're up to, and where can we find you?
Yeah, so the main place you can find us is on the YouTube channel. Our channel name is Living Well After Schizophrenia, or that's the handle. I think the name is now Lauren Kennedy West, which is my full name. You can find us on various social medias under similar. We have a link to it in the description of our videos. But something I also wanted to mention is that we have communities that we've built through Discord. They're online peer support communities, and one of them is geared specifically to people who are interested in using or trying metabolic therapies in an effort to treat their mental illness. And then the other peer support community is geared more toward people who are experiencing schizophrenia spectrum illnesses. And it's kind of a place for people to come together and relate to each other around that experience. So yeah, those are great resources for anyone who's looking for a community in either of those ways.
And are those communities, maybe you could share the link and we could put them in the show notes?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Okay, wonderful. Well, look, thank you so much again. I really enjoyed that. And it's a real privilege.
Thank you so much.